Hi, and thank you for tuning in to this month's LAS Baton Rouge chapter presentation. I'm Margot, and this is Brandy, and today we have a face that many of you might find familiar, Dr. Rob Mann. How are you, Dr. Mann?
I'm doing fine. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself for those members that might not know you, and maybe a little bit about your research?
Sure. Let's see where to start. I'm a historical archaeologist. I'm currently at St. Cloud State University in St. Cloud, Minnesota. I'm in my 8th year here, which is hard to believe. I'm actually going up for a full professor this year. But prior to coming to St. Cloud State, I was at LSU, Louisiana State University, between about 2001 and 2013, when I was the Southeast Regional Archaeologist for the state of Louisiana and a research assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Anthropology. So as I said, I'm a historical archaeologist. Margot knows that. We worked together on some stuff in Louisiana a few years back. I used to be the president for the Baton Rouge chapter of the LAS, and worked with a number of the members, especially on the Galvez town site in Ascension Parish, Louisiana. I'm a long way from that now. Here in Minnesota, my background prior to coming to Louisiana was in the French colonial period and the fur trade in particular. And so now that I'm back up in the Great Lakes and back up in Minnesota, I've turned my attention back to some of that research. I've been working with some graduate students on some fur trade era materials and sites here in Minnesota, which has been, kind of nice to get back to some of that research that I had not been doing for a number of years. But another thing that has happened since I've been here is I've become interested in a 19th century conflict that I knew very little about before coming to Minnesota, and that is the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. And several of my graduate students and I have been looking at U.S.-Dakota War fortification sites for about the last 4 or 5 years now. And so it's turned into a bit of a research program that I didn't anticipate when I moved back up to this part of the world, but it's been very interesting, and very little archaeology has been done on the types of sites that we've been investigating in the last few years. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today as well.
Great. We're really excited to hear about it. Whenever you're ready, just go ahead and share your presentation.
All right, very good. Let me see if I can get this PowerPoint to come up here. Okay, you guys can see that okay?
Yep.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the slideshow, hopefully. Okay. That's not quite the view I wanted it to be. How do I just make it?
Maybe try that. Yeah.
Hide presenter view.
Go down to screen. Or here, so if it's on PowerPoint, if you go down to the right-hand corner, I'm thinking about the little icon, the screen icon in the right-hand corner next to your Zoom function. Yeah, try that. Return slideshow. Yeah, let's try that. I haven't seen it give that before.
Yeah, it's never done that before either. I use it all the time for classes, and it always just brings up my PowerPoint. That was kind of weird. Let me see. Present. No, resume slideshow.
There's an arrow at the top of the resume slideshow. What is that showing? Like just above it? Add or remove. I don't know what that is.
Add or remove buttons. Let me try if we just go from current slide. It says start slideshow. What is going on here? Sorry about that.
No, this is, that's fine.
Technical.
This is exactly why we have the editing tool too.
Right, yeah, that's weird.
Not just for me stepping over my words.
Should. Oh, maybe.
Shouldn't be anything
That
on it, I wouldn't think, right?
I don't think so. No, because it's his screen, so.
Okay.
Yeah, it's whatever it is on my end here. What is that up
The
there?
only time I've ever seen you do that's for class. Like when we're in
I've never seen that resume slideshow
No,
thing
me
pop
either.
up.
It's weird.
Yeah, it kind of has locked me out of the slideshow for some reason. Let me just go back to the home file. Let me save it, close it, and try opening it again. And let's just try. So
It does not
so
want
this
to
is
see
weird. So I think it's now which screen I'm showing, because I have my a docking laptop, and
Mhm.
it is showing the slideshow on my desktop monitor, but it's not showing it on my laptop, which is what you guys can see. So I
Yeah.
think I need to go into my settings and grab the right screen. Let's see what that did.
There we go.
That showed you my desktop?
Mhm. Well, it's showing the presentation itself.
Oh, it is.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Ah, hey, there we go. And yes, we're off. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
Okay. So today what I'm going to talk about is a project and a site that a graduate student and I worked on about 2 years ago now. It was a U.S. military post that was built in response to the U.S. Dakota War of 1862. And it was built late in 1862, and it was occupied for about 3 or 4, maybe 5 years beyond that. So I'm just going to get started here and talk a little bit about the history of the U.S. Dakota War. Like I said, I knew very little, almost nothing about U.S. Dakota War of 1862 before coming to Minnesota. Like a lot of Americans, I think, when you think of the 1860s, you think of the Civil War. And so the U.S. Dakota War of 1862 gets overshadowed by that because it took place right in sort of the beginning stages of the U.S. Civil War, and very, very few people outside of Minnesota are aware that it even happened. For people in Minnesota, especially Dakota and descendants of the Euro-American folks that were here, though, it is still very much on people's minds. It's still very much an active part of people's understandings of themselves and their communities. And it still, unfortunately, creates a lot of tension between peoples today. So it's a very, in some ways, very sensitive topic here in Minnesota. There are a lot of feelings on both sides about the war and how it unfolded and how it happened, and the ongoing ramifications. That was something that was also quite striking, and something that I had to sort of learn about as I started to research this a little bit. So in the 1840s and 1850s, Minnesota was really just starting to open up to Euro-American expansion. And at that time, of course, a lot of this expansion was driven by the ideology of manifest destiny. And so, this is an image that kind of shows that process with the Euro-American settlers heading west, with this idea that there was, they had this God-given right to expand from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, and that they were protected in this by divine intervention. And in Minnesota, it was really kind of more than just an ideology. It was actually a material happening, like it was happening on the ground in the 1840s and 1850s. And a lot of immigrants, both from places in the East here in the US, but also places in Europe, were coming to Minnesota, oftentimes brought by ads like this one. There's cheap land in Ottertail County, and it's really, all you have to do is come, right? Just get yourself to Minnesota and you'll get all of this cheap land, and it's fantastic for agriculture. And it was really kind of played up. That there were advertisements like this in newspapers all over the eastern US, and there were advertisements like this in European countries as well, and agents on the East Coast and agents in Europe to recruit people to come to Minnesota. And a lot did. Of course, there were already people here in Minnesota in the 1830s and 40s, and they had been here for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that includes the Dakota. There were other native groups here as well. Won't really go into those relations right now, but it was the Dakota that bore the brunt of this immigration in the 1840s and 50s primarily. It was Dakota lands that were primarily the object of these immigrants. The Dakota, of course, had been in this part of the world for a very long time. The fur trade had been ongoing in Minnesota for decades, if not a century or more by this time. And so it wasn't like they didn't know or understand Europeans or European ways, but they didn't kind of understand the new colonial process of settler colonialism, right? People coming to not just trade and barter and maybe live close by, but sort of not obtrusive in their midst. This was very different. And on the other side of the equation, a lot of the immigrants coming from both the East Coast and from Europe had never really had experience with native peoples before, unlike the fur traders, right, who knew and understand native ways because it was to their benefit to know and understand native ways. The incoming immigrants were interested in farming and growing towns and cities, and they really weren't interested in developing relations with native peoples. And so that was a very different dynamic than the earlier fur trade era in Minnesota. And it led to tensions that overboiled in August of 1862. August of 1862 was a year where there was a lot of drought in Minnesota. So crops had failed, game was scarce. Dakota people had been maneuvered onto a fairly narrow strip of land along the Minnesota River in the Minnesota River Valley. And there were a number of agencies there to sort of oversee and manage the Dakota from a Euro-American perspective. And one of the things that these agencies did was they paid annuities and in both money and in supplies to Dakota peoples based on the treaties that they had signed in the years leading up to 1862. Well, as we mentioned at the top, 1862, the U.S. is in the middle of a civil war. And so people in Washington and farther east aren't really that interested in sending money and supplies to places like Minnesota, to the Dakota, when those supplies and money and people and men are needed elsewhere to fight the ongoing civil war. So that leads to a lot of tensions here in Minnesota. It was a hot summer. It was a drought summer. Supplies were running low. Dakota people were on the verge of starving. And yet the agents at these Indian agencies would not release the supplies that they had because they were under orders not to, or they just didn't want to. And they were waiting on new shipments of supplies and money from Washington, D.C. for these annuity payments. Violence broke out in response to these pressures, and once the violence occurred, it spread very rapidly. And so in August of 1862, a portion of the Dakota did rise up and take up arms, and felt like this was an opportunity, like it was sort of the last straw. And they saw potentially an opportunity because of the Civil War. They knew that soldiers from Minnesota had been sent south to fight in the Civil War. And they felt like if there was ever going to be an opportunity when there were fewer soldiers around, it was now, because they knew that people had, that soldiers were being recruited and sent south. And they thought this might be an opportunity to push Euro-Americans out of the Minnesota River Valley and maybe even out of Minnesota. Most Dakota leaders, like Little Crow, realized that that was probably not the case. That is, they realized that this was probably a losing fight to begin with, but they didn't feel like they had much choice in the matter. A lot of young Dakota men wanted to stake their fortunes in this way, and felt like this was their opportunity to do that. So Little Crow and Big Eagle and some other leaders among the Dakota took up the cause and did go to war with the Europeans, Euro-Americans in Minnesota. I should say that a large number of Dakota people did not. It was by no means a unanimous decision among the Dakota. There was a lot of uncertainty in a lot of communities. A lot of communities didn't want this fight, realized that it was going to bring bad things ultimately to the Dakota. And so it wasn't as if all Dakota joined the fight. In fact, a number of Dakota groups and communities did not. But those that did began raiding Euro-American settlements and hitting U.S. military installations and those government agency houses as well. And it was quite violent. It was quite a violent response. And in response to the violence, Euro-Americans basically had sort of two options. Many of them fled the area and went to places like St. Paul, where the military did have a presence at Fort Snelling. They also went to some of the larger cities where they could find shelter, St. Cloud being one of those places as well. And this is an image taken in 1862 of a group of Euro-American settlers fleeing the Minnesota River Valley and looking for safe haven in some of the larger cities. Reports were coming in almost daily to the newspapers, and there was a lot of fear-mongering. There were a lot of reports that sort of over dramatized and exaggerated the situation, but it was a violent time. However, the thing to keep in mind is that the response to this from the Euro-American perspective was one of surprise, as if they couldn't believe that it was happening. whereas most sort of objective observers were like, well, how could you not know that this was coming, right? The tension was in the air. There were lots of things going on. But the response from Euro-Americans was almost universally, I say almost universally because it wasn't universal, but almost universal condemnation and actual calls for genocide. And I don't throw that word around lightly, right? Genocide is a serious topic and a serious thing. But there were calls almost daily in newspapers in Minnesota for Euro-Americans to simply go out and kill Dakota people and to be rewarded for it. There were even calls for monetary payments for proof that you had killed a Dakota person. So so it was not a good time in Minnesota, right? There was a lot of violence, and the response to the violence was more violence. The fighting only lasted a few months, a few weeks actually. I'll go back really quick to this map. It ended basically with a battle here at Wood Lake between Dakota forces and U.S. forces. And the U.S. forces were able to take the battlefield, and the Dakota that did not flee surrendered. A number of Dakota, maybe a couple hundred, fled Minnesota into the Dakotas and then farther north into Canada. But the rest sort of surrendered here at Wood Lake, and that was kind of the end of the immediate warfare, the end of the immediate fighting. In the aftermath, over 300 Dakota men were found guilty of war crimes, essentially, and they were slated to be hanged. There were appeals made to the U.S. federal government, and in fact, Abraham Lincoln actually got personally involved, and he commuted the sentence of all but 38 of those 303 Dakota men who were sentenced to be executed. But those 38 men were hung in December of 1862 in Mankato, Minnesota, and it is still the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. So today there are memorials to that event in Mankato from both a Native perspective, mostly from a Native perspective, that you can go and visit today. The Dakota, both those who did not participate in the fighting and those that did were rounded up by U.S. troops, and they were force marched to St. Paul, where they were put into a concentration camp below the walls of Fort Snelling, which was the largest military installation in Minnesota at the time. They spent a very hard winter of 1862 and early spring of 1863. Disease was a problem. Supplies were still short. There was starvation and other problems that led to the deaths of a number of Dakota people, mostly women, children, and the elderly. Most of the men, those that were not executed, were still imprisoned, and the others had fled to the Dakotas or farther west or north to Canada. In 1863, the Dakota were removed from Minnesota, but a number of Dakota peoples over the course of the next couple of years sort of kept coming back into the state. And this is an image of Little Crow's wife and two of his children from 1864 when they were captured and brought back to Fort Snelling, to the internment camp, the concentration camp there as well. So while things wrapped up in terms of the the bulk of the fighting in late of 1862, things didn't calm down in Minnesota for the next 2 or 3 years. There was still a lot of tension and a lot of uncertainty about what would happen next. So, in response to the Dakota, the U.S. military did establish a number of military garrisons in the state, sort of a line of forts between Fort Snelling down here. These are the twin cities right here of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So Fort Snelling, and this line of forts heading all the way up to the Dakotas up here at Fort Abercrombie. And this line of forts was really an important chain of forts, sort of demarking the line between native territory to the west and Euro-American controlled territory along this line into the east and into the south. This line also goes south into Iowa. The other thing that happened that's kind of important to mention is that those settlers that did not flee and seek shelter in larger communities often built what are known as settlers' forts. And that's actually what really got me interested in this topic. There were over 80 of these settlers' forts built in central Minnesota. So I'm here in St. Cloud. And so let's see if I can find myself probably about right in here in Stearns County. And there were a number of these settlers' forts that were built at places like Fairhaven and, let's see, Maine Prairie, and some of these other, Forest City, that was a settlers' fort. A lot of these places that are kind of shown up as forts were really not forts in the military sense, because they were not built by military engineers. They were just built by people who happened to live in the area. And so in 2015 and 2016, my research into this topic really started here at this settlers fort in Fairhaven. And we were able to successfully sort of locate some of the remains of that quote unquote fort, because it really wasn't a military style fort in 2016. But that has led to, looking for some of these other sites, including there was a settlers fort built at Sauk Center, but the military came in a little bit later in 1862 and established an actual military post there. And so that's kind of what the rest of this talk is about. It's about the background and the archaeology that we've done at this U.S. military post at Sauk Center. Sauk Center was a very small village in 1862. Probably fewer than 100 settlers with a few scattered farms in the surrounding countryside. We have a number of images of this fort, which is really great for us as archaeologists. But the images are sometimes inconsistent. They tend to all line up and agree on sort of the big issues, but there are some issues that are not in disagreement. The fort did change over time. We know that it was expanded at least once during its occupation, and so that's part of the issue that we have. But it was a stockaded fort, sort of looked like a Western style fort that you might see in a Hollywood movie, that kind of thing. How many bastions it had is a question that we don't know, because the images show different numbers of bastions, and they also show them in different places. So that's a little bit, a bit of an unknown. But it was built around a settler's store, Mr. Pendergast, who had a store right there in Sauk Center in 1862. And so they sort of fortified that store. He also had a big barn on his property. And so the military essentially took over those two structures, the Pendergast house and store and the Pendergast barn. And then they built this fort around it with barracks for men, stables for their horses. These were mounted soldiers. And then officers' quarters along this curtain wall over here. And they also had some housing for citizens. You can see sort of out here, and I'll show you in a minute, This says road, and it says road over there as well. Well, this road was a really, really important road. It was the part of the Red River Oxcart Trail that linked Manitoba, Canada, with St. Paul, Minnesota. And the commerce up and down that road was really important. Métis communities in Manitoba on the Great Plains up in Canada were buffalo hunters, and they would bring buffalo hides from the Red River settlement in Manitoba, which is today Winnipeg, or near Winnipeg, all the way down on these ox carts that were built with no metal, not a stitch of iron, and they would haul them overland all the way from essentially what is today Winnipeg to St. Paul, Minnesota. It was a braided trail, and so there are a lot of different branches to it, but this was one of the main branches of the Red River Oxcart Trail, and it came right through Sauk Center. This is another drawing of the fort. We think it's contemporaneous. It matches in some ways, but you can see here, so this is the entrance to the fort. Here's the road again, but there's a bastion on this corner of the fort in this image. There's not a bastion on the corner of that corner of the fort in the previous image. So that's, you know, some of the discrepancies, but you can see Pendergast's house in the middle. You can see the barracks for the men over here. Pendergast barn is somewhere in the background there. And you can see the stagecoach coming into and people walking along what is actually sort of a spur of the Red River Oxcart Trail. And this is one of my favorite images of the fort. This was drawn by Della Veeder when she was a older lady, and it's a memory map. This is her memory of going through the fort in 1863 when she was a teenager. We don't know exactly when it was drawn, probably sometime in the early 20th century. She happened to stop by Sauk Center, and somebody asked her, can you remember what the fort looked like? And so she just sat down and sort of sketched out her memory of the fort. There are a couple of things that are kind of really important about this map. She draws the road on there for one thing. She shows the Red River Oxcart Trail. So it must have been, you know, it made an impression on her. These are the gates of the fort. There's Mr. Pendergast's house, as she remembered it, right inside the fort, which lines up with all of the images that we have. Here are this housing for citizens, and she notes the people, Miss Ed Smith and others that she remembered living there. She notes where the well was located, and that shows up on other maps as well. This is the Pendergast barn, but she doesn't call it a barn, and that becomes really important in just a minute. She calls it a COM period. It's the commissary. It was taken over by the military and used as a commissary. She shows the stables. She shows a bastion on all four corners, which is the only map that shows a bastion on all four corners. So who knows what was up with that? But she does show where the doctor's house was. These were the officers' quarters over in here. She has just about everything. She's got the men and their barracks over here in the right location as well. And so she wrote down, left Wisconsin 1863 in covered wagon. And then she notes who she was with. She was with her mother and father and grandmother, and then she was with 3 of her uncles and their families. So I think it's just a fantastic map with all of that detail. She must have been probably in her 60s or 70s when she put this down, but she got a lot of the details correct. And her memory of this not being a barn, but being a commissary is kind of really important to our investigation. So this is a more official map of the post. We don't know exactly when this one was drawn, but probably sometime late in 1862 or early in 1863, but it was clearly done by a military engineer. It's to scale. All of the measurements are written on there, so 440 feet there. They don't all line up exactly, right? So if you tried to scale it exactly. Sometimes it doesn't work. The measurements don't all correspond, but we know, again, there's the Pendergast house, barn and stables of Pendergast right here. Here's the well that Miss Veeder remembered being behind the Pendergast house. And then there was another, actually this is a sink, that was a privy or an outhouse. Here's the military officers' quarters and those quarters for civilians, the men's barracks over here, and the stable and stable yard for the horses. Remember, these were mounted soldiers. So once we had this map, and we were able to we got really lucky in that the corner of the Pendergast barn had a large stone as part of the foundation. A lot of barns around here are built with big sort of glacial erratic boulders as part of their foundation, and one of them happened to be used in the on the corner of the Pendergast barn. And even after the barn was gone, that stone actually still stands today, and it was used as a surveying marker for the modern subdivision that is in the area today. And because of that, we were able to scale this drawing to Google Earth and overlay the fort onto the modern landscape. And you can see there's a cross street here. This is 7th Avenue and Birch Street. But here's that stone right here on the corner. It's still there. It actually has a plaque on it. And we were able to use it plus the scale that we have, plus the northing, the orientation of the fort, to overlay this map on the landscape today. And we got permission from a property owner right here on the corner. We also had permission from the property owner over here. I won't talk about the work that we did there so much. It didn't turn out as unambiguous as we had hoped, because this house was built in the 1880s. So it was built just after the fort was torn down, probably. And so it's difficult to tell whether or not the artifacts that we were finding are from the house from the 1880s or from the fort of the 1860s. So, but this house on this corner was built in the 1950s, and there was nothing there prior to about 1955. So when we find 19th century artifacts in the front and side yard of this house, we can be fairly confident that they are related to the fort. So that's where we focused our efforts, here in what we called the barn area. This was Pendergast's barn and stable. But remember, Ms. Veeder, she referred to it as the commissary, and that's going to be important. And then we focused our other efforts over here in the officers' quarters area. We really wanted to find the stockade line, but you can kind of see where the stockade line kind of goes into the back of the house. Well, that's also where the gas line goes, the fiber optic cable goes. So there's a lot of disturbance, underground disturbance. The water line goes into the house. So we weren't able to fully excavate where we think the stockade line would have crossed, because it's probably disturbed by these underground utilities. Okay, so what did we do? So I won't read all of this, but we basically had a two-phased archaeological investigation. The first was a metal detector survey. And we used two different kinds of metal detectors. And I'll mention that just briefly, because we knew that some of the materials might be very deeply buried at this site. When they built the house in the 1950s, there was a newspaper article about when they were excavating for the basement or the foundation of the house, that they encountered some artifacts. And turns out they were probably horse bones and other things, but they mentioned like clay pipes and broken bottles and stuff like that. So we knew that there might be some stuff sort of buried kind of deep in the ground. So we used both very low frequency metal detectors and pulse induction metal detectors. And the very low frequency metal detectors are really good at about 8 inches to a foot below the ground, whereas the PI detectors, the pulse induction detectors, can penetrate much deeper, maybe as much as 3 feet below the ground surface. And so we wanted to be able to find both near surface artifacts and artifact concentrations and possible features, and maybe even more deeply buried artifacts and artifact concentrations. So we used two different kinds of metal detectors. We swept the front side and backyards of the property. The property owner was very generous to allow us to go and dig up his yard. We were really successful with both of the surveys. So you can see the different colored flags are the different kinds of metal detectors that we use, the VLF, the very low frequency, and the PI, or the pulse induction detectors. Now, there's a lot of modern sort of garbage in the yard, as you might imagine. We found coins and pennies and nickels and quarters that dated to the from the 1950s on. But we did find 19th century materials as well. And I mentioned the commissary or the barn area. In that part of the yard, we found a lot of tin cans, and which might not sound too exciting, and typically, you know, archaeologists aren't really super excited about finding old rusty cans, but in this case, the cans were very diagnostic, very particular types of cans. These are hole and cap cans. They date, they're diagnostic of the period between 1820 and about 1920. They were the most prevalent type of tin can during the Civil War, for example. And we know that during the Civil War, U.S. military installations were supplied with lots and lots of foodstuffs in these tin cans. And so once we kind of recognized what we had, and like I said, we know that there was no building on this lot prior to about 1955. The only thing that was there prior to 1955 was the Pendergast barn, which was used as the commissary in the 1860s for the U.S. military post there. So, so once we kind of realized that, these cans took on an even more important role, and we're pretty certain that they represent the kinds of cans that would have been present in the commissary when the military was there in the 1860s. And in fact, the can that you can see here, I'm trying to get my cursor to circle over it. My cursor gets lost sometimes on my laptop. But we're able to sort of estimate its dimensions, both in its diameter and maybe how high it was. And it probably held either tomatoes or some other kind of fruit, peaches or something like that. Certain types of cans were associated with certain types of foodstuffs, and so different sizes were used for different kinds of things. So you can, if you can estimate the size of the can, you can also have a pretty good shot of determining what was in the can. So that was really important. And we found a number of these hole and cap cans, or parts of hole and cap cans, in what we referred to as the barn area, which was the commissary during the fort's time there. So there again, you see those two images. You see the military drawing on the left and the Veeder memory map on the right, showing the barn and labeled as a commissary by Mrs. Veeder. And we have other documents, recorded documents from the military, stating that they used the barn as the commissary as well. So that was really kind of an important discovery for us, because it let us know that we were where we thought we were on the fort site. So we then shifted our attention to up near the officers' quarters. And once we realized that we wouldn't be able to really kind of go for the stockade line, we've spent most of our time trying to define possible features related to the buildings that might have housed the officers on the fort. And we found a number of artifacts that we think are indicative of that. The artifact on the left here is probably an officer's sash buckle. We weren't quite sure what it was. We knew it was a buckle of some sort, but it didn't match a lot of the buckles from the 19th century that I was familiar with. And so we sent a picture of it to an archaeologist who works on a prisoner of war camp in Georgia, Civil War prisoner of war camp in Georgia. And he had found almost identical buckles in the officers' quarters on that prison camp. And his interpretation is that they were sash buckles. They were non-military, but they were purchased by the officers themselves. This was not military issue, but only officers were allowed to wear sashes as part of their uniform. And so they could, you know, sort of embellish them with things that they would buy on their own. And these pretty ornate buckles seem to be one way that officers were doing that. They were sort of putting these buckles on to embellish their sashes. The artifact on the right is also some sort of suspender buckle, we think. The archaeologist in Georgia also found these types of buckles associated with the officers' quarters there. And his feeling was, again, that these were pretty elaborate and ornate suspender buckles, not like the rather ordinary suspender buckles that I'm used to finding, which are almost always iron and just kind of a little square buckle. This one is much more ornate. And so again, he thinks that's a reflection of the officer's status, that they could purchase these. These are made out of copper or brass, stamped copper or brass. Purchase these more ornate buckles as a way to sort of display their status within a military context. So those two artifacts were really kind of important. And then this artifact also came from the officers' quarters. And when we found it, I initially thought that we had found part of a pocket watch, the housing for a pocket watch that might have held a photograph. And these were very common during the Civil War. And again, it would have been something that would have been common to the officers more so than common to the enlisted men. And so I kind of put that interpretation out there. I sent in a little blurb on our work to the SHA newsletter a couple of years ago, thinking, you know, that this was a pretty close match for the bezel part of the pocket watch to hold the glass case over the photograph. And while it still may be, I got a response back from archaeologists out further west saying that she thought it was actually a wind cap for a pipe. And it does match very well for that as well. And the other thing, the interpretation is also very especially towards the middle of the 1860s and later, these types of pipes were becoming increasingly common, but they were more expensive, as you might imagine, than just a regular white clay pipe. And so again, who would have access to these types of pipes with these types of accoutrements on them, this little wind cap to keep your embers from blowing out, would probably have been the officers. So these pipes would have been coming into Minnesota probably right about the 1862, 1863 time period, and probably the only people associated with the fort that could have afforded them at that time were the officers. And so again, it would have been a very visual display of status that you could smoke a pipe like this, and especially a pipe with a wind cap, you know, to keep it tamped down and to keep the wind from blowing it out. Okay, so based on all of that, our metal detector finds, we did do some excavations, very small scale. We opened up some shovel test pits in areas that we thought were maybe indicative of where structures might have been based on our overlay map and Google Earth image, but also on concentrations of artifacts found in the metal detectors. And you can see in STP1 there on the left that we did get a little bit of a feature. We don't know what it is. It's nice and square. Maybe it's part of a structure or a building, or underneath a structure or a building. We have, an opportunity potentially to go back and do additional work on the site. Now, because we didn't screen all of the shovel tests or all of the metal detector finds, we were just kind of trying to find the metal objects that set off the detector. We obviously screened all of the shovel test bits, and we got a much wider variety of material culture, including not only the square nails, but also 19th century ceramics, ironstone ceramics, one with a registry mark that almost certainly dates it to the time of the fort. It's the type of registry mark on the back of a plate or a platter or some kind of serving vessel that would date it between 1842 and 1867. We know there was nobody there before the fort was occupied in the 1860s, 1862, 1863, other than Pendergast, and his house was much further away. So we're pretty certain that these ceramics relate to the men stationed there at the fort, and likely to the officers living in the officers' quarters. And these types of ironstone ceramic would, of course, have been available to the officers, but probably not available to the enlisted men. So it would have been another status marker, symbol of their class and status at the fort. Just a couple of other photos of the excavations showing a little bit of the profile there. Then we did find some circular features. That one doesn't show up very well. And some other sort of square linear type features that might relate to structures. There's a lot left to do at this site. We could potentially go back and open up larger blocks of excavation units. The property owners have been very generous, and even the neighbors, once the neighbors kind of saw what we were doing, they were like, "Oh, do you think something might be on our property?" And yes, we absolutely think that there might be stuff on your property. So we could probably go back and hopefully one of these days we'll get a chance to maybe even take a field school up there and open up additional units to try and trace out some of these features in a little more detail. You can see the feature in the north wall or the south wall of this unit is a root where a tree fell over, but the feature to the north of it is possibly a large post. And so we do have some post-like features. We've got some possible structure-like features. And then, of course, we are very close, we think, to the stockade line. We just need to find a place in the front yards of these houses where we won't encounter those underground utilities, and see if we can intersect the stockade. And then once we have the stockade, we kind of know where the barn and the commissary was. We sort of know where the officers' quarters were. But once we have the stockade, then the entire site kind of opens up to us, because then we can trace out where everything else able to use the data that we got from the metal detecting and from the excavation to write his thesis, and he just finished it. He just defended back in May, so very happy with that. And then because of the work that I've been doing with him and with other graduate students, I've started to kind of synthesize some of that information into a chapter that's coming out in a book, hopefully early next year. The book is called Historical Memory, Archaeology, and the Social Experience of War and Conflict. It's being put out by the University Press of Florida, and it should be out sometime around February or March is my hope and guess. And I'm hoping that this research continues. We've been very fortunate, as I said, to have the support of the Sauk Center Historical Society, the property owners in the neighborhood, and our work has been supported by grants from the Minnesota Historical Society. So I definitely want to give a shout out to them. They've been very generous with their grant funds to allow us to do this kind of work. And that's all I have for you today.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting. Like you said in the beginning, it's kind of crazy to think, you know, most of us think of the Civil War during the 1860s, but I imagine there's a whole lot more of instances like what was happening in Minnesota happening all over the country. And then
Yeah,
well, I was just
especially,
gonna say, being able to see that how well the documents lined up, the truthing of it, ground truthing, once you went and did the archaeology of it itself.
yeah, that was exciting for us. I never thought that I would be so excited about tin cans, but when we found those hole and cap cans, it really did confirm that we were near that commissary in the barn, and we knew the barn was the commissary. And not only that, I didn't mention it in this talk, but the VLF metal detectors. One of the deepest objects that we found with with the PI, the pulse induction metal detectors, was in the barn area, and it was down about 32 centimeters below the surface, which was much deeper than those VLF machines can penetrate. And it was a horseshoe. And so I think that the horseshoe, that deeply buried, was from the barn occupation, the Pendergast, when it was still a barn. But then all of the artifacts that we found sort of above that level, including all of the tin cans, they were much closer to the surface, about 5 to 10 to 12 centimeters below surface. They were from the U.S. military occupation. So we had some decent stratigraphic evidence, and then we've got the all of the tin can evidence right there in the area. And once we kind of knew that, that really did open up the site for us to kind of say, okay, well now, if this is the barn, then this area over here has to be the officers' quarters. And like I said, we have other property owners who are now sort of excited about what might be buried in their yards. And so we could ask even other questions about where other structures and that stockade might be. And so hopefully we'll get a chance to go back and do that.
Were the homeowners, were they aware that a site like this existed prior to you coming out there? Because I mean, with all the documentation that was there, it seems kind of hard to believe that people didn't know it was there, but I guess that's kind of, it becomes the name of the game once land starts transferring and broken up and things like that.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting because that rock, that stone that was part of the Pendergast barn foundation, actually has a plaque in it, a historic plaque. And even with that plaque there are people living in the neighborhood who had no idea that they were living on top of a 1860s fort. Now, the property owner there on the corner, because that stone is essentially in his front yard, he was aware of it, but it never crossed his mind that there would be anything like buried in his yard. He never made the connection that there could still be artifacts and other kinds of archaeological remains buried in his front and side yard. So that was really a surprise to him, even though he knew that he was there on the site.
Hmm. Yeah. Do you have any questions? Do y'all have any plans to try to locate similar sites in the area in the future once the COVID thing is over?
Yeah, once we can actually get back out into the field. Yeah, this has become quite a research project. I have been contacted now by numerous people who think they know where other forts were located, including other settlers' forts. And the settlers' forts were nowhere near as large or as complex as these military forts. And so they're a little harder to pin down archaeologically. But if you remember, there was that map that showed a line of forts from Fort Snelling all the way up to Fort Abercrombie in the Dakotas. Along that line was another place called Painesville. And the Historical Society at Painesville has already been in touch. They think they know where their fort was located. They think it was under the athletic fields at the high school. And so it's a big open area. It could be interesting if the school would allow us to do some work out there. We could incorporate high school students into the project as well, and maybe do some public outreach and public archaeology. So that's on my to-do list. I'm hoping to get a graduate student interested in that. There have been reports of mini balls found in that area, which would be from the time period. And we do have some good images of the Painesville fort as well. We've got some maps and some drawings. So we could potentially do very similar kind of work at that site. And so maybe in the next year or two, we'll take a look at that one.
Yeah, that'd be very exciting for sure.
Yep, sounds good. Well, thank you so much for presenting today. We really appreciate it. It was a very interesting presentation.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Like I said in my email, I've enjoyed sort of staying in touch with the BRLAS through these video talks. And so I thought, well, it's a chance to catch up with some folks and say hi to all of the Galveztown crew that are still out there and actively part of the BRLAS, and kind of just let people know what I've been up to in the last 7 or 8 years now.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone appreciates it. And so to all of our members, thank you again for tuning in. I know typically November and December, we don't have meetings, in-person meetings because of the holidays, but stay tuned. We'll let you know if we have virtual presentations or what's going on. And until then, thank you again.
Bye, guys.